You have to pity the disciples. They were, in the days right after Easter, confused and scared. The brutality of the crucifixion took away their dream of a Messiah. They were left shattered and full of doubt. Everything they had counted on had been ripped away, and they had been thrown into a new territory with no map and no directions. From our 21st century perspective, we have an advantage over the disciples. We are 2,000 years removed from the violent events of Holy Week. We know that Jesus' story did not end on Good Friday. Here we are in the midst of the Easter season, and we have shared the joy of Easter and Christ's resurrection. We celebrate glorious, mysterious events. We know about the rolled away stone. We know about the empty tomb and the folded burial cloths placed on the slab on which lay the body of Jesus. We have heard about the heavenly messengers who asked the women, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen." We know there is good reason to celebrate. But those poor disciples, they were still dwelling in the shadow and the sadness of Jesus' death. They had only heard rumors and kind of confused descriptions of a risen Christ from witnesses who were kind of breathless and shocked. They had received a jumble of reports that didn't make any sense to them. So instead of thinking resurrection, they were worried about grave robbers. Instead of rejoicing at new life, they were still grieving a sudden, horrible death. Even as they tried to comprehend the announcement, "The Lord has risen indeed." Instead of rushing out to share life-giving good news, they were almost frozen in place, able to only talk about the overwhelming events as they unfolded and as they sought to get some clarity. Essentially, they were paralyzed by fear. When Jesus does finally appear to them, the disciples still don't understand. We might expect them to immediately bow down and break out in praise and worship, but the opposite is true. They are startled and terrified, as the gospel said today. Instead of seeing a vision of new life, they see a ghost. In that dramatic moment, when Jesus appeared to them, they couldn't recognize the activity of God. This is important for us to keep in mind when we are searching for signs of God's presence or proof that God is with us. In the midst of the chaos of our lives, we sometimes miss it altogether. God may be trying to speak to us, but we may not be able to hear or understand. We're too closed. It can be difficult to remember that God has promised always to be with us. So difficult that we repress our capability for recognition. Our first response when things go wrong or the unexpected happens may be doubt or panic or even terror. And this is nothing new. It's always been that way, ever since Jesus was born, and way before that, if we look in the Hebrew scriptures. The Gospel of Luke tells many stories of surprising God encounters. Jesus enters into people's lives, and that changes everything. Nothing seems familiar. It would be like any of us trying to drive somewhere new without a map or a GPS. We can feel disoriented and even afraid. When we open our lives to Jesus, when we open them up to Jesus, he speaks to that fear with the gift of peace. The power of God's peace is that it can reverse the initial effects of anxiety and suffering, of doubt and loneliness. Just thinking about God's peace changes everything. The first time we see this is in the very beginning of Luke's gospel, when Jesus is born. The angels announce his birth to the shepherds, who are terrified. There's that word again. The shepherds have the same reaction at Jesus' birth as the disciples have at Jesus' death. The angels answer their fear with the words, "Fear not." And they reassure the shepherds by saying in a chorus of voices, think St. Peter's Christmas pageant, "Glory to God in the highest heaven, and on earth peace and goodwill toward men." That peace enables the shepherds to travel to Bethlehem to encounter God firsthand as he lies in a manger. God's peace gives courage. A few days after Jesus was born, that gift of peace was given to Simeon, an elderly prophet who had waited his entire life to see the Messiah. When infant Jesus was brought to the temple by his parents, Simeon rejoiced by saying, and as we sing, "Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace according to thy word." His lifetime of yearning and waiting and searching finally ended in receiving the promised peace. Simeon could place himself in God's hands, knowing that he would be safe. God's peace gives comfort. When a sinful woman dared to bathe Jesus' feet with her tears and anoint him with oil, Jesus forgave her sins. She was then restored and made whole. She heard Jesus say to her, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." Her lifetime of suffering and shame was over. God's peace heals. Jesus healed a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years, but he didn't just heal her body. He gave her the additional blessing of comforting her soul. As he released her from the illness that had isolated her and trapped her for years, Jesus said, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." God's peace can soothe our weary souls. And that is the power of God's peace. It can change lives. Again and again, we see Jesus encountering people whose lives have been thrown into turmoil and despair. He offers what is needed most: peace. In the midst of chaos, despair, and fear, Jesus offers the gift that soothes the souls and touches their weary hearts. "Peace be with you," he says to them. He comes offering the gift some do not even realize they need. Peace reassures. Peace diminishes fear and allows us to relax so that the divine presence can be received. As believers, we may yearn for the quiet certitude of faith. We might wish that our faith would guarantee a smooth passage through life. But the reality is that our lives are often tumultuous when we suddenly find ourselves stunned by events that change our lives. Just like the disciples, we can feel terrified. An unexpected death, the loss of a job, the betrayal of a friend. We feel like we've lost our way. We're completely disoriented. We've had our fair share or unfair share of hurricanes, fires, mudslides, and floods, both literal and metaphorical, in recent history. It wasn't until a few months after Irma and Maria hit the Caribbean that our daughter Devon could begin to tell the whole story of her experience. In the immediate aftermath, we were all happy that she was alive and safe. But it's only now that she can elaborate beyond the fact that she rode out the storm through to the other side. Only a few weeks ago, she could share with us when the reinforced storm shutters over the door of our bunker started to shake and buckle. I thought, I could die here and now. I was really terrified, Mom. This is the same Devon who tagged sharks in South Africa and climbed the Himalayas and sailed from Patagonia to California. And now that she was settled on a lovely Caribbean island, she had a moment where she thought her life was going to be taken away from her. That moment changed her forever. Life will never be the same. Precisely in such a moment, Jesus offers peace and reassurance. He enters into our turmoil and upset and into the residual effects to remind us that we are not alone. We may live with the devastating consequences of loss and grief for months and years to come. Yet Jesus' promise, I am with you always, reminds us that we do not have to face this on our own. Sometimes we experience the peace that passes all human understanding through the words and actions of others. And sometimes others experience it through our acts of kindness. Jesus tells the disciples and us that we are called to be witnesses of these things. That's when we can put the peace Jesus has shared with us into action for others. Who do you know who is tired or doubting or afraid? Where have you witnessed despair or grieving? Who is terrified because they feel alone? Those are the situations